one last putt into the chains to claim her third consecutive Women's Open World Championship. And there it is.
Once again, we are back here at Winthrop University for the USDGC and the Throw Pink Women's Disc Golf Championships. And prior to the events, I am thrilled to be joined here by PDGA Hall of Famer Elaine King. Elaine is a 5-time professional disc golf world champion, a 3-time Masters disc golf world champion. She served on the board of directors in 2 different eras of disc golf and has competed and helped to grow the game in 5 different decades. Elaine, thank you so much for joining me today.
It's a real pleasure to be here.
Well, we're going to talk a lot about disc golf, obviously. However, you found disc golf a little bit later in your life, kind of in your adulthood. Go back. Before the game of disc golf, as a kid, what was childhood like for you, and what things were you drawn to back then?
Well, I have to say that I was a tomboy. I had an older brother, 2 years older than me, so I would tend to hang out with his friends when they came over, and we played football and baseball and ball hockey on the street, like all kids did in that era. And so I was always drawn to athletics and never specialized in anything in particular, just played a lot of sports. So I played them casually. In my elementary school, I played all the sports because that's what you did. You played basketball, you played baseball, etc. Ran a little bit of track, not particularly well, but I liked the hurdles and the high jump. Then in high school, I played volleyball, I played field hockey, did a little bit of tennis, just sort of dipped into all kinds of different sports.
What drew you to that? Some people specialize as kids and they fall in love with a couple games and that's what they stick with for a long time. What was it about jumping into all these different sports?
I guess I was just interested to try different things, and I was never particularly ultra talented in anything, and I was never pushed a certain way, so I just did a little bit of everything.
Were you pushed in any direction by your family when you were growing up? Maybe academics, music, anything else like that?
Oh, well, music definitely. So all the kids learned how to play piano. My mother would sit with us and make us practice every day, which was great because I can play the piano decently now, although I'm not in practice. But music we definitely had to do, and the other thing was swimming lessons we definitely had to do. My parents didn't want anyone drowning, so we all had to take swimming lessons to a certain extent. So I went reasonably far in the swimming, but again, I wasn't strong enough, I don't think, to be really good at swimming. So I didn't really develop a lot of strength till later when I was in my 20s when I started doing weightlifting. Mm.
Talk more about music. So you said you had to do piano. Did you ever grow to resent it while you were being made to do it? Oh,
every kid resents having to do stuff instead of just doing whatever they want at a particular moment. But I'm eternally grateful that my mom made us stick with it, because it's brought me a lot of pleasure over the years.
When you were a kid, what did you dream about? Did you aspire to become something when you grew up? Did you dream of accomplishing anything, or did you dream of accomplishing anything big? What was that day-to-day like as a kid? What did you daydream about?
I remember the first thing I wanted to be was a nurse. And my mother said to me, "Why don't you be a doctor?" And I said, well, the doctor has to know so much. I don't think I could ever have that much knowledge. So that's when I was quite small. But as the years progressed, I was drawn towards science, in which I eventually got a PhD in analytical chemistry. So that's from my father's side. My father's a nuclear physicist, so he was a professor at the University of Toronto for most of his career.
What did you like about what he did? What did you admire about that?
I mean, I guess it's just the logic, you know. My father was more the logical, calm, considered one. My mom was a little more emotional. She was definitely a big worrier, and you know, it was the yin and the yang. So, you know, I recognize now that there's certain aspects where I take after my mother, and probably a little more take after my father in temperament.
So when you were going through school, did you know exactly what you wanted to do with science as you started to get involved with it, or did that change during your schooling?
Oh, it definitely changed. But in second year, I took organic chemistry, and that for me was the real game changer, because I had always considered chemistry to be pretty boring. You know, we'd study the crystal structure of rocks, which I guess was interesting, but it didn't seem very, very relevant, or acid-base reactions, and it was kind of like, yeah, I guess that's important. But suddenly, organic chemistry was the chemistry of life. It was the chemistry of all the reactions that went on in the body, and so I found that super interesting. And then the following year, I found this obscure course called Analytical Chemistry, which had as its goal to take an unknown substance and figure out what that was. So it's the measurement science. So I think that was a little bit before the CSI series came along, where that suddenly became very much in vogue. But yeah, I was really drawn towards that, and thought it was fascinating that you could take this little white powder, put it in these various machines, and put rays of light through it and figure out what it was.
I want to ask about a little crossover. Obviously, most of this is going to be about disc golf, but while you were going through your schooling, what did you know about disc golf or Frisbee in general?
Well, I knew absolutely nothing until I met my future husband, Eric Vandenberg. And so when we started dating, I mean, I knew what a Frisbee was, and we had some Frisbees that we'd throw around badly to each other. But Eric was very interested in Frisbee, and he played freestyle with his friends. So on dates, he always wanted me to, you know, play catch. So I would, you know, throw it very poorly to him. He'd be sprinting this way, sprinting that way, trying to catch it, and he'd throw it right to me, and I would like do this, and I couldn't catch it. And so that's kind of the way that went. And then we got married in 1983, and saw a poster advertising the Canadian Championships. So I was living in Toronto, as I had grown up and spent most of my life in Toronto, Canada. So it was on the Toronto Island. And so Eric was all keen, oh, let's go down and watch. And so, yeah, that's fine. So we went and took the ferry across the bay and got to Ward's Island, and found this one fellow freestyling with himself. And so we went up to him and asked him, where's the Frisbee competition? And he said, oh, they're golfing over that way. And I just thought that was the weirdest thing. It's a Frisbee competition, why are they golfing? But of course they were disc golfing. And so we were able to observe the final 9 for the Canadian Championships in 1983 and watch the players there. And my husband was so excited. He thought, well, finally, here's a sport he could play with Frisbee where you don't need a partner of equal ability, which of course for freestyle, you need a partner of equal ability. That was not me. So the next weekend, we took our 117-gram backyard Frisbees and went out and started playing this course.
Paint us the picture. What did you experience when you went out there to Toronto Island, which is still a beautiful course today?
Well, the course back then was much shorter, and maybe it's my imagination, but the bushes were a lot bigger. And I was always throwing my disc into this bush, and so I'd have to, you know, stick a foot in there and throw it out, and I'd get full of spider webs and gnats and mosquitoes. So it wasn't the most pleasurable sport I had ever played, but my husband was so into it. And eventually, as we were playing, we saw people who were playing with different discs, and we obtained some Midnight Flyers from Ken Westerfield. And so the Midnight Flyer was the golf disc of the time. Now that resembles an ultimate disc. So players today will realize that's nowhere near the technology that they're throwing. And I had trouble with it because my fingers are pretty short. So it was really hard for me to get my fingers around the really deep rim of a Midnight Flyer. And I don't think I would have continued on with the sport if it had not been the year that Innova came out with the Eagle or the Arrow. And so in September of '83, we got our hands on arrows. And suddenly it was a beveled edge disc, the very first one. I could get my hand around it, and I could throw it farther and a little bit more accurately. So that gave me a little bit of hope that I could, maybe master the sport a little bit better than I had.
So then as you move forward, you've got the Arrow now, you're holding a real beveled edge disc, and this really was the birth of beveled edge discs, essentially, and the game kind of skyrocketed equipment-wise steadily after that. How long did you get frustrated by the sport of disc golf playing with Eric before you kind of started to fall in love with it yourself?
Oh, gosh. '83, we were just playing casually. '84, Eric started playing some tournaments. And I didn't feel I was ready. I didn't feel like I had control over what I was doing. But I would go and accompany him, and sometimes I'd take score. But I'd watch what the players did. I'd watch, the etiquette and the decisions they were making, et cetera, and just kind of soaked it all in. And so I saw that there were some women playing. Joanne Gallagher, Mina Cordero, Sue Pei. So I was watching the women. I was very intimidated by the women. To me, they seemed to be like really tough chicks, and which is really funny because it's like a nicer group of people you couldn't find. But I was very intimidated by it. So I waited until I think '85 before I played my first tournament.
1985, that's where you joined PDGA, correct? And now you've competed over the course of like 5 decades. 5 different decades you've competed in. But I want you to talk to me about what the landscape was like from '85 leading up to that first world title in 1991. What was disc golf like competitively?
Competitively, well, it was a lot more casual than it is now. When I started playing, if it was summer, none of the guys were wearing a shirt. They were smoking joints, they were drinking beer as they played. It was all super casual. Now people were quite competitive. Those who were, the leaders of the tournament, there was definitely a core group that were really diehard. But we're still on the tail end of kind of the hippie generation that invented Frisbee and had Frisbee become popular. So it was definitely a counterculture kind of movement, which was interesting for me because I was sort of like your straight-laced good girl. And so it was really a little bit odd for me to be in that environment, but I loved it. The people were interesting. I got to meet, over the course of time, people from all walks of life, chatting together, bonding, hanging out together. And as I witnessed this, like that to me is the magic of disc golf. Certainly at that time back then where nobody knew what disc golf was. We were just this little band of offbeat characters. And so anyone who played disc golf, there was an immediate tie for you and these people. And that to me was the magic of the time.
I want to ask about baskets because Oak Grove is celebrating its 50th anniversary this year, and that's the first course that we've seen with disc golf baskets. When did Canada get baskets, and what were they like putting on those early iterations of the equipment?
Okay, let me just think. I think it was '79, it might have been '77 that baskets went in on the Toronto Island and Centennial Park in Etobicoke in the west end of Toronto. So Toronto had 2 18-hole basket courses very early on, sponsored by Orange Crush.
The soda?
Yeah, sponsored by Orange Crush. And I believe it was Bob Blakely, who was working for kind of a subsidiary of Whammo. who was instrumental in getting these two courses put in. And I think Ken Westerfield also played a large role with that, but it was Bob Blakely who did that. So we had these two 18-hole courses. The chains were really thick on the baskets, so you had to putt hard. And they were shallow rimmed baskets.
How did you have to putt? You said you have to putt hard. I feel like that contradicts a lot of what people feel like now when they think of old baskets. It feels like you have to putt super soft and land it perfectly. Can you kind of go into that a little bit more?
Yeah, so I don't know why the chains were thicker on the Toronto courses than they were on other courses. But yeah, back then you had quite a variety of targets. So there were the cone targets that when I went to, what was it, Illinois maybe? And it was just kind of this plastic thing that went down like that, and you hit it, and the idea is the disc would hit it, and it would just kind of go with the angle of the cone, and drop into the basket. And that worked if it was a little bit nose down, but if it was nose up, it would just kind of bounce back. So whenever we went to a new place, there was sometimes a real adjustment into how we had to putt. And then once I went to Rochester, New York, and they had ground baskets. So what that was is there was a pole of rebar, and then there was some chicken wire around it. And you were putting downwards, definitely nose down. You hit the rebar, and the chicken wire would catch it.
I don't think I've ever heard of that in my 20 years of playing this sport. Is that the only place that you saw those types of baskets?
I think that was a Jim Palmieri invention, if I'm not mistaken. I mean, it was really hard to get baskets. The only people that manufactured them were Wham-O in California, and they were expensive, and they were patented. So, people used other options.
As you progressed as a competitor, within 6 years, you had won your first world championship, from joining in '85 to winning in '91. What was your skill progression like in those 6 years?
Oh boy. Well, when I first started, as I was mentioning, I didn't show any particular talent for the sport. But as I observed the tournaments and observed the men playing and observed the women playing, it became apparent there was a much smaller group of women who played. And I thought, well, if I worked at it, I could probably get pretty good. And there wasn't nearly the competition. So that to me was my incentive of, I'd like to get better, I'd like to play and be competitive with this smaller group of women. So I started lifting weights because to me, the reason I wasn't throwing far was because I didn't have enough muscle. Now, as I know from my years of experience now, it was my technique rather than just raw muscle, but it doesn't hurt to have a certain amount of muscle to get my arms stronger. So I started doing that. There were no coaches, there was no internet.
Yeah.
So the only way you could get any idea of how to throw better was by watching other people. There was nobody giving disc golf lessons. It just wasn't this ultra competitive environment. It was more of a counterculture environment. So I'm not quite sure how I drifted from just throwing with my arm to getting my body behind it, but somehow I made that transition in the time.
Were there any women, maybe that didn't coach you at the time, but were there any women that you looked up to as you were kind of building your skills along the way?
Yeah. Well, I definitely watched Joanne Gallagher. She had lovely form. And when I started playing with the women, I realized that the women throw the disc a lot lower. The men would throw it a lot higher. And, I think it's still true today that it's easier to see form when the women throw than the men throw. Maybe it's just because the speed is a little bit slower or the limbs are a little bit shorter. I don't know what it is, but to me, watching the women throw, I got to understand the mechanics a little bit better by observing it. So definitely watch Joanne Gallagher and then Mina Cordero, Sue Pay, they were local women, and I just watched and tried to soak like a sponge and tried to imitate.
Did they ever reach out and just give you advice unsolicited as you were playing?
Oh, always. I mean, the first thing I distinctly remember is when I was caught in a bush and like I'm trying to do the typical thing where you're trying to go like that, and then they were like, no, put your feet the other way. It's like, oh. Yeah, I was honestly getting tips like that, getting tips on how to throw sidearm. Yeah, it was not super competitive. These tournaments had a $20 entry fee. Yeah. And you might get $33 if you won. It was just like low stakes. It felt more like, I guess, the way people feel at league or something, just like casual.
Well, you mentioned wanting to get better. You started lifting weights for disc golf. Clearly, you're a competitive person. Did that competitive drive start early for you, or was that something that developed later in life?
Oh, I've always been competitive. To me, like sports, you should be trying to do your best. You should be trying to get better. Nothing drives me more crazy than people playing volleyball and just swatting the ball back and forth without using proper form, you know? Like, if you're gonna do it, do it. So that's the approach I took with sports. Now, I may not be very talented in a sport, but I'm at least trying to be better, trying to observe the correct technique and imitating that.
You were clearly a weekend warrior. There were no touring professionals maybe a couple in the late 80s, 90s, but you were a weekend warrior. What did that practice schedule look like working towards that first big world title in '91?
Yeah, practicing was tough because, let's see, at that time, Eric and I were living in an apartment in downtown Toronto. So, you know, we'd go on the weekends and play the Toronto Island. We might take a big trip out to Centennial Park where we had to take the subway to the end of the line and then take a bus because we didn't have a car. So we played on the weekends, and eventually Eric bought me a pole hole, which was a huge thing. It was really hard to get your hands on them, but the Toronto Island was updating their baskets, so he bought one. So it came on a wooden base. So Eric mounted 4 casters on the bottom so that it would roll. And so we'd take our pole hole from our apartment, down the elevator, walk down the streets of downtown Toronto to this vacant lot where they were going to be building something, but they hadn't started yet. And so we'd practice putting.
And how did that feel with all the people on the outside who probably didn't know what disc golf was? Did you have to get over some kind of embarrassment of people watching you, or did you just not care at the time?
Well, we got very strange looks, like walking this pole down the street. And you know how the sidewalk is. It's got all the partitions, and so we'll go clunk, 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 ching, 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 down a couple blocks. But once we were in the vacant lot, I mean, you know, nobody much bothered us. Every now and then someone would say, "What are you doing? What is that?"
Well, I want to ask, though, let's jump to '91. From what I saw, you won every tournament that year, at least PDGA sanctioned, including the World Championships. Talk about that year. I don't think I've ever seen anything like that on the PDGA website. What was '91 like, and how was it different from previous years?
I guess I had been building up the skills over those intervening years to the point where I knew I had the ability. It took me a really long time to figure out how to play in the wind. And so I think I had started to master that. And then I had been receiving a lot of coaching from Gail McCall of Discraft. And Gail was interesting. She wouldn't coach me on how to throw. She was coaching me on my mental game. And so that was very interesting, and I really appreciated that. But Gail was talking about, should you lay up, should you go for it, you know, and so I think she was helping me build my mental decision-making abilities and a bit of mental toughness. And so by the time I got to '91, I felt like I had the skills, I was understanding the mental game. And 91, it's sort of like I knew I could win. Like I knew I had what it takes to win the World Championships. And, you know, you have to remember it was a smaller community. Like just the disc golf community was really, really small still at the time. And you knew who all your competition was. There wasn't anyone just springing out of the woodwork. You'd see them coming. So I think I went into that year with a lot of confidence.
Clearly, because you ended up winning everything, and then you won your first world title. I want to ask, I'd love for you to paint the picture of what that week was like. And for some people that are watching, they might not know what a previous world championship was like format-wise.
Oh, yes. So let's see. You had your players meeting on Monday night. Tuesday, you played 2 rounds of golf. Wednesday, you played 2 rounds. Thursday, you played 2 rounds. Friday, you played 2 rounds. Saturday, you played a semifinal, if you made the cut, and followed by the final 9.
So many rounds of disc golf. The courses were obviously shorter. What was your big focus going into that week? Did you go out and socialize after all the rounds, or did you just try to focus on winning the tournament, go home, get some rest, that kind of thing?
Oh, of course you socialized. What are you going to be, a hermit? I think you have to remember, rounds of golf didn't take 3 or 4 hours. They were much shorter. So they would take maybe 2.5 hours. So they could say the starting time was 9 a.m. for the first round. It was 1 p.m. for the second round. By 4 o'clock, you were in the pool with everybody else. You know, there was a tournament hotel, and people almost all stayed in the tournament hotel. And so this hotel was just taken over by disc golfers. And so there was plenty of time to relax in the pool, zinging minis around everywhere. And then you could go to dinner with your friends and still get a good night's sleep. So, I mean, I kind of miss those days where you could play a lot of golf and have fun and see people that you might only see once or twice a year.
When you won that first world title in 91, sounds like you had a great week. It sounds like you had a blast. But at the time, what was the chatter like about professional level disc golf? Was anybody talking about being a touring professional? Was anybody daydreaming about one day bigger sponsors, bigger money getting involved?
Oh, absolutely. From the time I joined the sport, people really felt like it was on the cusp of getting big. And, you know, in the 80s, there were some huge sponsors. There was Bud Light sponsoring tournaments, sponsoring freestyle. There was Hacky Sack, which had huge sponsors. There was a lot of money in the 80s, so various world championships had sponsors that poured, for the time, a really decent amount of money in. But then we hit the 90s, which was more economic downturn, and so that sponsorship money just sort of dried up. But yeah, every year people were thinking we're going to make it big. Just a few more years, we're going to make it big.
And then what about you? Were you thinking ever, science maybe might take a back seat one day. I might try to take this on the road full time if it keeps growing?
Oh, it just never entered my head. I mean, especially for the women's game, there was just not that much money in it that you could ever think of supporting yourself. Now, people would save up and spend their summer vacation going around and playing tournaments. And you could call that touring, but you know, people would have to save up thousands of dollars because it would just be dispersed, you know. The first touring pros came on the scene, I think, in the early 90s. You know, Steve Valencia, Dan Ginley, you know, a crew out there from California. We have to mention Glenn Whitlock also as being someone who toured. But, you know, it was not self-sustaining. You had to have some monetary reserves to do it.
So then for you, from 1991 to 1994, you won every single year. You were the world champion. Even though it was your side job, side hobby. Did you start to feel a target on your back growing at all? Did you ever feel pressure going back to defend a world title? Like, what was that like?
You know, anything can happen in disc golf. You know, you can take a 2 on a hole, you can take a 10 on a hole. So there's always that, you never know for sure. But at the same time, like, you could look around and know who your competition was because it was such a small sport. There were definitely people from Europe who came to the World Championships every year, from Japan, but not very many, just a handful. So you really knew who your competition was. So I had a lot of confidence based on, you know, my work ethic, I guess. I practiced a lot. I was serious about it. I wanted to play well. Certainly didn't win everything, but I had the confidence. But then, of course, gradually with time, you could start to see the players coming. So Juliana could start to see her coming. Des Redding, Angela Chigfry, you know, Valerie Jenkins. Then one by one, the field started getting more crowded with women who were very athletic, who'd played sports seriously from an early age, and so they started to challenge, of course.
As you moved through these world championships, these seasons where you started to have a lot of success, were you also thinking about the growth of the women's side of the game? Were you actively going out and doing things to help grow the sport from that level?
Well, there again, from the early days, there was always talk of getting more women into the sport, for both the women and the men, because of course the men were spending all their free time playing disc golf. It would be nice if there were more women there, and it's still to this day. We're, I think, starting to get more traction now, but still the proportion of women who play versus men is pretty much unchanged, you know, somewhere around 10%. And I think it's, if you look at any sport whatsoever, there is this drop-off of women playing the sport when they reach their 20s because they start having families. And there is also a much smaller proportion of women who like to play individual competitive sports. A lot more women like to be competitive, but in a team environment. And then the majority of women who are athletic like to do athletics in a non-competitive fashion. Fitness classes, spin classes, that kind of thing. Yoga.
So then for you, I know that after your world titles, your first stint of world titles, you won again in '97, you started to do some work with the PDGA board as well. So I want to ask, I mean, you were such a competitive player, you were a world champion. What drew you to join the PDGA board of directors at that time?
I think it was when I had spent a year in Sweden. My husband and I went to Sweden because I had finished my PhD and I was doing postdoctoral work in Sweden. And so I'll just do a little aside about Sweden here. So we found that there was a course in Linköping where we lived, and that was in the course directory. So we went and found the course and then met the people, and of course, whenever you go to a new place, you have a built-in group of community and friends because you play disc golf. So if you play disc golf, you're always 100% accepted. Certainly, that's the way it was back in those days. So we got in with that group. We did traveling around. It was the first year they had a PDGA tour. So PDGA sanctioning was still something that was kind of optional in Europe. But I think it was Mats Bengtsson who organized the PDGA tour of 7 stops. So we went and played that. And so I met not only people from Sweden, but from other countries. And so I became quite interested in trying to connect the North American disc golf scene with the European disc golf scene, because things were very different there. They were kind of like, oh, rules, that's very pedantic sort of thing. So I wanted to become regional director for the PDGA so I could be a source of communication. So I did get elected, and in those days you wrote letters. There was no internet, okay? There was no internet. There was no email. Or, I mean, email was just in its infancy then. People didn't have emails. People didn't have computers. Yeah. So you wrote letters. So I would write a newsletter and I would send it to the regional coordinators in Europe and also the state coordinators. So that was my job, is to write letters, get letters back, you know, try and get a little bit of communication and a sense of belonging.
What were the main debates in disc golf on the organizational level at the time? What were people wanting to do with the sport, and what were the obstacles to doing that?
Oh, well, of course, I mean, everyone was thinking, you know, just 5 years from now that it's going to explode. So there's a lot of talk about getting big sponsorship. That was really quite naive at the time because, you know, we had one paid employee, the administrator, who worked from his or her home and kind of handled everything. There was a financial director who had financial oversight, but really, you know, we were not set up as an organization to be able to handle big money. You know, we just didn't have the infrastructure. So there was that discussion. Of course, discussion of standards. The rules of play were still really developing at that time. There was no competition manual. There was just the rules of play. And then there was like an extra section for tournament play, which later became divided out to the competition manual. So a lot of questions about rules, technical standards for discs got brought in before my time. So the density of the discs, if it was a certain diameter, it could be no more than a certain weight. And during my time on the board, Dan Roddick, Stork, brought in the idea of technical standards for other aspects of a disc. So the sharpness of the rim, the flexibility of the disc. And so those got approved. And then targets. Now targets were tough because there was one patent by Whammo for a long time, and so there could be no other targets. So when that patent ran out, other manufacturers came in with their targets. And so then we started to get a proliferation of targets that were quite different from each other. So Jeff Homburg stepped in and managed the Technical Standards Committee. And so for many, many, many years, Jeff was the only guy who was measuring all the targets, doing all of the flexibility and thickness and weight tests for the discs.
You talk about rules, and these days, in the modern era of disc golf, some of the big topics of discussion are on stance violations like foot faults and time management, like clocking a player, the 30-second rule, for example. What were the rules discussions back then? What were the hot button topics that people were trying to figure out?
Mandos. So, mandatories. If you missed the mando, the rule was you had to unwind. So if you threw on this side of the tree, you had to then throw backwards, past where you were, and go on the proper side of the tree. And you know, sometimes there was a line on the ground, and most of the time it wasn't. It was just the tree. So the unwinding, that was a huge discussion that people debated fiercely, and eventually the unwinding went away, which makes a lot of sense. So for example, if there's a mandro, because there was a playground there, you didn't want to be throwing over the playground again, you know. So eventually that got changed. The 2-meter rule started to be a hot button of discussion. Because courses were short back then, it made sense at the time that you had to have some ways to distinguish the score separation. And so if you were in a heavily wooded area, one way was to have that 2-meter rule, which Dan Roddick will tell you it's because that's how tall he was. So that's how it came up. And I mean, people weren't carrying measuring devices, and most people in North America, certainly the US, that had not gone on the metric system, they had no idea how much 2 meters was. So our rule was if you can reach it, it was good.
Wow. I'm a little speechless, but also I completely understand. Our game is still very young and still developing. I want to ask one more kind of philosophical question about your mindset about disc golf at the time. These days, post-pandemic, I, for the first time, saw the phrase shrink the sport. People seemingly feeling like the culture of what they used to have in disc golf is going away because of the growth of the sport in whatever direction it is now. What was the chatter about that back then? What did growing the sport mean? And were there people back then that were afraid of the sport growing?
Well, growing the sport was 100% putting more courses in the ground. There were not very many courses in the ground when I started. And so I was like driving 14 hours to Louisville, Kentucky from Toronto to play in a tournament because there just weren't that many courses. There weren't that many tournaments. There was a maximum of 2 tournaments per city per year for many years. So to talk about, you know, standards, because some cities had disc golf courses, most cities didn't. So it felt like it was very unfair to have more PDGA tournaments where you got points, and points were your basis for your invitation to the Worlds, not player rating. There was no player ratings back then. It was points. So there was a restriction. So people who played disc golf were traveling large distances to play in a PDGA sanctioned tournament to get points, to get an invitation to the Worlds. So this is why more courses was the #1 way to grow the sport.
So back then it wasn't even about money. It wasn't even really getting, I mean, yes, the big sponsorships would be nice, but from your perspective, it was literally just putting courses in the ground.
And it was expensive to get, you know, 18 pole holes or 18 baskets. So the money aspect was how could a school, a parks department raise the money to get these baskets in.
Move forward just a little bit. So you win your 4 world titles, 91 and 94. You win again in 1997, 5-time world champion. At the time, you were sponsored by, I believe, Discraft. When did your first big sponsorship come to be, and what did that feel like for you?
Well, it's funny with sponsorship because it was, I mean, like I guess I was sponsored by Discraft from way early on because Gail would just give me discs and give me shirts and say, here, try this. There weren't very many discs at the time. So you got to remember, I started in '83 and I got an Arrow. And then a year or two later, the Aviar came out. And then the Phantom from Discraft. And like each year there might be one new disc mold. And there was, you know, Discraft, there was Innova, there was Lightning, there was a few companies that came and went, like Benwall. And so you'd have 6 discs. I mean, that's all you'd have. And so it was a lot of years before, you know, players had a big bag of discs. And players threw everything. So when you talk about sponsorship, it was really interesting when my husband was doing work on getting the date of installation of all the courses, which has been his big project. We were looking back over the old magazines, and you know, in like 97, 98, people who were clearly sponsored by Innova, like Dave Greenwell, was making comments on the Cyclone, which was a Discraft disc. Like, players tended to throw a mixed bag because there just wasn't enough discs. Yeah. And of course, with time that changed. So as I said, I guess I was sponsored by Discraft from earlier on, and then there was formerly this Discraft team, and so I just kind of slipped in under that. But I mean, I'm not sure I ever signed a contract with Discraft.
Is that just how it was back then?
It's just how it was.
A lot of handshake deals and stuff like that. I want to move a little bit past your world championships, the pro world championship. Moving into the 2000s and the 2010s, you started playing some age-protected stuff. You continued to win. What were you witnessing changing about the game from the 90s through the 2000s? Not just from a competition standpoint, but from how disc golf was ran in general.
Mm-hmm. As we moved into the 2000s, I think the sport shifted a little bit from the counterculture hippie mindset to something that had a little bit of a wider appeal. It was like an alternate sport, maybe, rather than a counterculture sport. So we did start to see people coming into the sport, men and women, who had much more of a formal athletic background. And so, Juliana, Des, that from the women's side, from the men's side, there was a lot more men who were, clearly athletes. And so the standard of competition grew. The players were able to execute better shots. Scott Stokely throwing the disc crazy distances, both backhand and sidearm. So the level of athleticism improved. People started putting successfully from longer and longer distances. So you could just see that the skill level of the sport was really rising and rising and rising.
And then also, from a technical place, you were mentioning that a lot of times there was no internet, there were no computers. Disc golf was ran via mail. It was ran via file cabinets upon file cabinets. There was one PDGA employee that dealt with all of that. But in the 2000s, we started to get more into that. We started to get more internet. Things started to get more run on the computer. How did that transition work for not only the organization, but for the players? How did disc golf change in that regard?
Yeah, well, it was a real game changer when you could see the Pro Tour schedule on the internet, on the PDGA page. Prior to that, it was hard getting information about tournaments in the 80s and even into the 90s. The prime source of information was the Disc Golfer magazine, where the schedule would be published, in print form. And so you'd phone the tournament director and say, hey, I'm interested in going to your tournament. Can you tell me some details, what park's it going to be? Can you give me directions? Because you needed directions. Yeah. Like, there was no GPS on your phone. There were no cell phones, people.
I'd be done for.
It is astounding, when I look back on it, that we got to places. We can thank Greg Hosfeld for a lot of that. Greg was the first course collector. He was a comedian, a juggler. He went around the US and he loved to play different disc golf courses. And so he'd try to find them. And when he eventually found the course, he'd update the directions, submit them to the PDGA so they could be incorporated into the next course directory, which had directions, from I-77, get off at exit 243, go 1.7 miles, turn right on this road. That's what the course directory was like back then, because that's how you could get it. I remember once in Baltimore just being so lost, we had to stop in a gas station, buy a map, and look in the index of the map of the street and, find where it was. Like, you used paper maps to get around back then. So, yeah. So it was a real game changer when there was information on the internet. You could go to MapQuest or something like that, print out the directions, and then follow them. Still, people didn't have cell phones till a little bit later on.
Well, I'm even thinking about signing up for a tournament. I'm assuming you have to fill out a form, fill out a check, mail the check, hope that they got it. Was that a tedious process? Did you ever run tournaments? Did you ever have to deal with a surge of checks coming into your mail?
I did not run tournaments at that point. There weren't that many courses. There was already established TDs, so there wasn't really the opportunity to run tournaments. For big tournaments, yeah, you would need to fill in a form, enclose a check, and mail it. But most tournaments, you just showed up the morning of. Yep. There wasn't going to be more than 72 people.
Even for the big tournaments?
The big tournaments might have 2 courses.
Okay. Well, Elaine, I want to ask, maybe jumping way forward, you were also on the board of directors in a completely different era starting in 2017. And disc golf has come a long way over the years. Even when I started playing in '03, it's come a long way. What were the new problems that you had to kind of address, and why did you come back to the board of directors at that time?
Well, I was actually encouraged to put in an application for the board of directors by some board members who were just wanting to get, I think they wanted a woman on the board. So I was happy to do that. Some of the problems, well, the Pro Tour was established at the time. So now there was a little bit of a conflict about how much money, time, and effort did we put into the Pro Tour versus everybody else. And of course, amateurs made up 85% of the membership. Yeah. And you know, the PDGA board felt like, well, we've got to continue to focus on the amateurs and giving them the best experience. So there was a lot about relationship management. So relationships with Disc Golf Pro Tour, relationships with UDisc, relationships like that where we were partnering, where the partner would go ahead and run with a certain mandate, and the PDGA would say, well, how can we support each other? And so that was one of the big focuses. Rules still continue to be a big focus, because what would happen is something would happen on the Disc Golf Pro Tour where there was this unusual situation where they were trying to apply the rule and couldn't. So, for example, you go out of bounds, the standard thing is you can move it a meter in perpendicular. And I guess there was one circumstance, one time, where that kept you out of bounds. So the only thing they could do is move in a different direction. And so then the rule changed because of that. So I think some of the rules have gotten pretty convoluted because of one-time unusual situations. Mm-hmm. But that's kind of where we are in the sport today. And maybe that's the correct way to go, is try and write the rules so they can be applied in any situation.
When I think of disc golf, I think of disc and I think of golf. I think of almost two opposites. This polished sport like golf that's very score-based, very competitive, and then you have the Frisbee on the other side, this free-flowing, artistic object, and we have this unique sport because of it. In regards to the culture of both of these things, Frisbee culture and then golf culture, in the future, what do you want disc golf to be? What percentage of both types of culture do you hope it stays?
Well, I think there's already a really marked divide between Disc Golf Pro Tour and the culture there, and you know, the way that's run versus your local tournament at your local course. And that's like all pro sports, right? There's the pro sports you watch on TV, and then there's the there's the sport you play on your local league of whatever type, which is a lot more casual. It's a lot more, the focus is on making friends, hanging out with people, learning skills, making connections. So I see that divide there, and I think it'll just continue. The Pro Tour is going to continue to have the spotlight, become what people want to do in their spare time is to watch really great disc golf and maybe learn a little something, be inspired. And then they'll go and, play league, play casually, play in some local tournaments. And that will be much more of just a disc golf community in your area.
I do think, at least from my recent experiences, I feel like there is a shot in my lifetime that we'll see disc golf in the Olympics. And I think it would be phenomenal. But if that happens and we have this professional-looking sport, what needs to be done to keep the culture of disc golf at the grassroots level alive?
Well, I mean, things change. It's inevitable. Nothing stays the same, right? So I think that at the grassroots level, we might even further subdivide that of leagues would be their own culture. And already, you know, there are fewer rules at leagues. For example, if it's legal to drink alcohol in the park, at your local league, you can drink alcohol. And I mean, for a lot of people, that is what they want to do. They want to just have a super casual experience playing disc golf. They want to do their putting league at their local brewery. And so I think we'll further subdivide that there will be this very casual, friendly, non-competitive, slightly competitive type of scene, and then you'll be your C and B and A tiers. And you know, the A tiers are going to be the minor leagues of disc golf. I feel like they're going to be much more serious, perhaps some local TV or video coverage, maybe slightly different standards than your B or C's.
Yeah. Talk about the growth of women's disc golf as well on the grassroots level. You said the ratio feels somewhat similar these days. Is that what you were?
It is. I mean, you can
Yeah.
look at the stats. The
Exactly,
PDGA,
yeah.
it's just, it doesn't move. Women are not going to make 20% of all disc golfers. I think it's going to stay what it is.
So you don't think there's really anything that could change that or move that needle?
I don't foresee it, because if we look at all other sports, it's the same for competitive sport. But that being said, as there's more people in absolute numbers who play disc golf, there will be more women in absolute numbers who play disc golf. And we're definitely seeing that. We're seeing, certainly on the Pro Tour, we are seeing the richness of talent. There are so many women. It's just the last couple of years, there's been this preponderance of women, many of them from Europe, extremely talented, who are now making it so exciting every week, because you have no idea who's going to win. It could be one of probably 20 women who realistically could win.
What does that make you feel like to see juniors players falling in love with the game at younger and younger ages and becoming competitive like this?
Well, it really astounds me when you get the younger, like the teenagers, the young teenagers, tweens even, who can throw a long distance. So I think that's a really interesting question about the mechanics of the sport. Do you really need muscle mass? Is it all about the mechanics for the women? And so I think there's probably a lot of scientific study that could go on there to say what makes a good thrower in the women's division. The other funny thing is, like when we look at my previous stint on the board, we were completely convinced at that time that disc golf was not a sport for anyone younger than 20, because disc golf required a long attention span. And people under the age of 20, typically, they do not like long attention span things in general. They like quick, fast action sports. So we felt it's something that was only, you know, so we ended up college age and above, looking to grow the sport. Well, clearly that was an outdated idea, because we've got so many younger players falling in love with the sport, able to manage the attention span. Man, some days I can't manage the 3.5 hours it takes me to get through some rounds. So I think that's interesting. So are we picking up a subset of junior players that do have that capacity for a long attention span, where there's a whole other population that just doesn't want to do that? I don't know.
I think it teaches junior players a really wonderful set of life skills as well, playing this game.
Absolutely. There's a lot about, you know, cooperation, patience, you know, managing the fact that you just double bogeyed the last hole, and now how do you manage that going forward? Yeah, for many of us, it continues to be a struggle of, you know, how do you put your best shot forward on your next shot?
What has the game of disc golf shown you over the years? What life lessons have you pulled away from this game?
So many. Disc golf has shown me confidence. It's taught me a lot about, you know, just meeting a whole variety of people. And, you know, I often think, like, I probably would never have met this person if I'd just been in, my scientific realm of life, which is my alter ego, right? And it's just fascinating. I'm meeting all these different people who do all these different things. And I think that is still the joy and the richness of disc golf, is just meeting people who have different ideas and different talents than you do, and really appreciating each other.
When it comes to course design, FPO course design in particular has changed a lot over the years. There's been a lot of heated discussion about what it should be like, who to design the courses for. Over the course of your career, what has the discussion around FPO course design been like? Have you been involved in these discussions, and what do you feel like a good FPO course should be?
Oh, well, I mean, at first, for decades, the women just played the same tees as the men. And so it's interesting when you look at player ratings and round ratings, that those of us who had played earlier on, those player ratings mean something different probably than today, where a lot of the women are playing on courses designed for women. Every now and then there'd be a tournament where there'd be, say, a water carry, and there'd be a woman's tee for that one hole, because perhaps not all of the field or any of the field could have that water carry. So I mean, it really has been, I think the Disc Golf Pro Tour has really brought forth this idea of a set of tees designed for women. And I think in general, they've done a really nice job of it. Occasionally there's a tee that's longer for the women than the men, making it a par 4, say. I think that is good. I certainly have been frustrated in my life with courses where I could not get a birdie. I couldn't throw far enough to get a birdie. So I was just like parring the whole thing, and it was actually kind of boring, because I throw as far as I can, throw a 150-foot shot, putt. So course design for the women's field, absolutely fantastic, should keep doing it.
While you were winning your world titles in the 90s, Ken Climo was also winning world titles in the MPO division at the same time. And I spoke to him a few years ago at length, and his memory for specific moments of these competitions, whether it's the biggest tournament or the smallest tournament, is so vivid. He's so zoned in on these competitions. What is it like for you looking back at your career? Are there any tournaments that stick out that you feel like you could recount shot by shot?
I don't think there's any tournament that I could recount shot by shot. I mean, there's certainly tournaments that stick out. And the ones that I remember most are the ones where I surprised myself with my performance. So probably, and I've told this story before, but the biggest tournament of my life, I feel, was the Circus City Open in Peru, Indiana, in 1987, where there were 17 women, and that was my first big win. Tournaments didn't really have the ABC tier. This one was called a World Cup. It was one of the early attempts to distinguish a series of tournaments during the year as being higher status. So I won that tournament. I had no idea that I had the capability to win. I mean, we had world champion Vanessa Chambers. We had distance champion Tammy Pellicane. We had this field of women with all these accomplishments. And I do remember getting 2 deuces in a row at one point in this tournament, which like everyone thought was this amazing accomplishment, 2 deuces in a row. And I distinctly remember the last hole where I got a 3 on it, and I was like neck and neck with Vanessa, and she went out of bounds. And so I really remember that hole. But yeah, that was the most amazing experience to win that event when I didn't even know I had the capability. And then I think 2 other highlights were when I won the U.S. Women's Championship in 2001, 2003. And again, I was not regularly winning big events at that point, but I did win those 2 tournaments. I think largely because there were some short technical courses that are really my bread and butter that I did really well in those tournaments. So those stick out in my mind as well.
You moved down to Raleigh, or Durham, North Carolina. And you've been here for, I think you said 14 years from a previous interview, something around that?
Yeah, I moved down in 2011.
What drew you to the Carolinas? Was it work, or was there a little disc golf that you were seeking out as well?
Well, it was definitely work. So I worked for GSK, pharmaceutical company, in Toronto, and there was an opportunity to transfer down to Research Triangle Park for a global role in GSK. So that's why we moved. My husband was 100% on board with it because, you know, there's a lot of disc golf here. And I mean, I had visited regularly to the Research Triangle Park area, and played while I was here. So I knew that it was going to be a really wonderful thing for disc golf. So yeah, we were both excited for the opportunity to move down to the Carolinas.
Well, you're still playing a lot of disc golf, and you're doing well. How do you feel now at this point in your career, health-wise, and how do you see the game compared to how you did when you were winning the world titles in the open division?
Well, health-wise, I've been having this really nagging hip flexor injury, which has been like completely frustrating to me. I've been, you know, really struggling the last 2 years, and I realize I haven't been throwing with proper form at all. And so I've finally got my hip flexor and the other muscles there to the point where I've got the right mobility and I can throw with the correct form. And now I'm trying to work on consistency, because now I've got these really bad ingrained habits of twisting instead of, you know, pulling the rope, as it were, to play. So that's where I'm at right now, is I'm trying to get my player rating back up, trying to throw more consistently. And I'm actually finally seeing the light at the end of the tunnel. I feel like I'm almost there. It's been great to be down south here playing disc golf, because there's so many courses, so many different tournaments. Yeah, we've just been having a lot of fun.
When I listen to you talk about disc golf, I see the energy and the passion that you have for the game. Have you ever had a time in your playing career where you didn't feel the passion, where you started to feel burnt out, or has the fire always been burning?
Definitely, I've had points where I've been frustrated or exhausted. You know, there was a point, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago where I was, you know, working really hard at my day job, and then we'd have tournaments scheduled in many weekends, and I would just get exhausted, and it's just like I don't have the energy for it. It's like I guess I still have the passion, but I just want to go to sleep.
Yes.
And I'm sure there's a lot of people out there who feel the same when they're trying to play on weekends and juggle a job, juggle family, where it gets all too much. But I don't know, I'm a lifer for disc golf. It's given me so much, and I get a crazy amount of joy when I can make that piece of plastic go where I want it to, disproportionate to any merit that really has. So yeah, I think I'll always continue to be playing, and there will be ups and downs, as there is with everything in life.
I have been told by some FPO players in the modern game that they don't get a raw satisfaction out of seeing the disc fly. They get satisfaction from winning tournaments. I've heard that from a few. For you, is there an element of throwing a disc that brings you an intrinsic joy? Is there a satisfaction from watching the flight of the disc? Absolutely.
And, you know, I've got to be realistic. I have never been the farthest thrower. You know, even, you know, back when I was at my, you know, youngest, strongest, winningest, I was never the farthest thrower. And that's getting more and more true today. I honestly don't know how women can throw close to 400 feet. I cannot do it. So I have to be realistic about my abilities. So it's, you know, given the course design and layout of many big tournaments, there's no way I'm going to be competitive. But certain other tournaments, I could be competitive if there's a lot of focus on disc placement. So it's great to win. It is like, I gotta say it, like anyone who's won a tournament knows it's really great to win. And it's especially great when it's taken everything you've had and there has been, neck and neck with one or more competitors and you had the mental stamina that you were able to do it. But that's not my only motivation. I mean, I've certainly won tournaments where I haven't played well. Yeah. And I don't get the same satisfaction out of that where I've played well but placed, ninth. Yeah. So that's a long answer to your question of, just the flight of the disc, like being able to control the disc, do what I want it to do, I get tremendous satisfaction out of that.
Is there a single shot shape or shot type that excites you the most about the sport of disc golf?
Throwing a good Anheuser is really a joy.
What type of disc would you throw that Anheuser with? What would give you the most satisfaction? Distance driver, putter?
Product placement here. Lately, I've been throwing the uplink, and man, I'm really starting to love that disc because it will hold the Anheuser angle if you throw it with just the right, like a titch of Anheuser and really hard.
Well, Elaine, we've talked a lot, we've covered a lot. We're here at the Throw Pink Championships, and there's players of all ages, like we said, competing this weekend. What are you most proud of this modern era of FPO player? And what do you hope to see in the sport of disc golf in the future, in your lifetime?
Well, I think it's just so exciting to see women who are just true raw athletes who could excel in any sport, but they've chosen disc golf as their passion. I think that's really amazing. And I honestly didn't think that in my lifetime I would see people choosing, like athletes choosing disc golf as their passion. And as I think we all realize, COVID just propelled this sport. That was the impetus the sport, apparently could take advantage of to get the playership that we have, to get the viewership that we have, and to attract these athletes. So there's that, and I think all the women in the crowd, the women who've come to watch the women play, and the men who have come to watch the women play. In the early days of Disc Golf Network, I know there was real angst about the fact that the women's side of the sport wasn't getting the viewership. And I think that's really dramatically changed now that there's a solid viewership where, a lot of the men are saying, well, I'm never going to be able to throw like the open men, but, I can throw like the open women. And so there's a lot to be learned from that. And that makes me really happy when I hear people saying that the women athletes can be a role model for them, for the men and the women.
Well, Elaine, I just want to say thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for sharing your story with me, and enjoy the week here. Enjoy your time here at the Throw Pink Championships.
Thank you so much, Brian.